The oil was still burning. 24 days after the Japanese attack, the harbor at Pearl still smelled of it. A greasy black film coated the water. The battleship Arizona sat on the bottom of the channel, her superstructure jutting above the surface like a broken tombstone. 1,177 of her crew were entombed inside her hull and would remain so. On the morning of the 31st of December 1941, a 56-year-old admiral from the Texas Hill Country climbed the ladder of a submarine tied up at a small pier. He did not want the job. 28 admirals had been considered before him. He was the 29th choice. He had refused the same command 11 months earlier, when the Secretary of the Navy had first offered it, telling Washington he was too junior. Now, with the fleet burning at his feet, he was being given it anyway. Over the next 3 years and 8 months, that quiet man from Fredericksburg, Texas, would make 3 decisions that destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy. None of them were made in public. None of them were claimed as his. The submarine was the USS Grayling. The admiral was Chester William Nimitz, and the ceremony that was about to take place on her deck was the strangest change of command in the history of the United States Navy. A change of command was supposed to happen on a flagship, a battleship, if possible. On this morning, at this port, on this admiral's first day of the war, there were no battleships left afloat to hold one on. So they used a submarine. Nimitz was silver-haired, blue-eyed, meticulously polite. He did not raise his voice. He did not slam his fist on tables. He wore his uniform the same way he had worn it for 40 years. Clean, correct, unremarkable. And on this morning, with the ceremony concluded and his assembled staff standing in the winter light on the deck of a submarine, he did the first thing that would define his command. He kept every officer Admiral Kimmel had trusted, every planner, every intelligence man, every logistics chief, the men who had been on watch during the attack. The men Washington was already looking to blame. Nimitz looked at them and told them, in words remembered by more than one officer who was there, that he had complete confidence in them, that the disaster had not been their fault, that the war was going to be won by the same men who had lived through the first hour of it. It was a decision made without consultation and against the political current in Washington. It was also the decision that would allow, 6 months later, the ambush at Midway, because among the men Nimitz kept was a 44-year-old commander named Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort worked in a basement, 2 floors beneath the old administration building at Pearl Harbor, behind a door with no marking, and a Marine sentry who checked every badge. A windowless concrete room held 12 desks and a rotating shift of 30 officers and enlisted men who almost never went outside. They called it Station IPO. Its formal designation was the Combat Intelligence Unit of the 14th Naval District. Its actual job was to read the mail of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Rochefort ran it. He was a slight man with a pinched face and thinning hair, and he worked in a worn smoking jacket over pajamas and carpet slippers because the basement was cold, and because after 72 straight hours in the same chair, he saw no reason to dress like a naval officer for the ventilation ducts. He spoke fluent Japanese. He had trained as a cryptanalyst in the 1920s, when American cryptanalysis was one man in a room. He understood the Imperial Navy the way a surgeon understands anatomy. He had cut it apart, over and over, for 20 years. The code his team was working on was called JN-25. It was the Japanese Navy's primary operational cipher. In the first months of 1942, Kaipo and its sister stations in the Philippines and Australia had cracked open a growing percentage of the traffic. By April, they were reading roughly a quarter of it in near real time. By May, sometimes more, and what they were reading was frightening. The Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing an operation of enormous scale. 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, transports. A strike force larger than any single naval formation the Japanese had ever assembled. And repeated across the intercepts, again and again, was a 2-letter code designator. AF. Whatever AF was, the Japanese were going there. Whatever AF was, they were going in early June. Rochefort read the intercepts. He read the geographic references. He read the routing of the fleet units. And he told Chester Nimitz, in a briefing in the second week of May, that AF was Midway Atoll, that the Japanese intended to seize it, that the seizure was a trap designed to draw out and annihilate what remained of the Pacific Fleet's carriers, and that the strike would come in the first 4 days of June. Nimitz asked how confident he was. Rochefort said he was as confident as he had ever been of anything in his life. The problem was Washington. 2 floors under an office building in the District of Columbia sat another cryptanalytic operation, the Naval Communications Intelligence Section, OP-20G. It was run by 2 brothers. Captain John R. Redman was the deputy director. His older brother, Rear Admiral Joseph R. Redman, was the director, and by the spring of 1942, the Redmans had decided that the code-breaking of the United States Navy was going to be run from Washington, not from a basement in Hawaii. Rochefort was in their way, worse than in their way. He was better than they were. His unit was producing analysis Washington could not match, that other flag officers were beginning to ask for by name, and that made a series of promotions and reorganizations in Washington politically inconvenient. When Rochefort's analysis said the target was Midway, OP-20G told Nimitz it was not. They told him the target was somewhere in the South Pacific. Possibly the Aleutians, possibly the west coast of the United States. The traffic patterns, they argued, pointed elsewhere. The AF designator, they argued, was ambiguous. Rochefort, they implied, was a talented officer who had convinced himself of a conclusion the evidence did not support. The Redmans were 3 ranks and 2,000 miles senior to Rochefort. They were the official voice of American naval cryptanalysis, and they were telling the commander of the Pacific Fleet, in the middle of the most dangerous 6 weeks of the Pacific War, that his own intelligence officer was wrong. Nimitz had 2 options. He could accept the Washington analysis, hold his carriers in defensive position around Hawaii and the west coast, and let Midway fall. If Washington was right, this would preserve the fleet for a later battle. If Rochefort was right, it would mean losing Midway without a fight and surrendering the initiative in the Pacific for another year. Or he could commit his 3 remaining carriers to an ambush position northeast of Midway, a location the Japanese had no reason to search. Trusting the analysis of a single commander in a basement over the collective judgment of Washington. If he committed the carriers, and Rochefort was wrong, he would lose them. The Pacific Fleet would cease to exist as an offensive force. Hawaii would be indefensible. The west coast would be exposed. He backed Rochefort, but he did not back him blindly. Before he committed the fleet, Nimitz asked Rochefort a question that has become one of the most quietly consequential exchanges in the history of American intelligence. Is there a way to prove it? Rochefort thought for a moment, and then he proposed a trick. Midway Atoll, he explained, had a freshwater distillation plant. The plant was essential. Without it, the garrison could not survive on the island for long. If Midway were to broadcast, in the clear, uncoded, on an open radio channel, a message reporting that the distillation plant had broken down and that fresh water was running critically low, the Japanese would intercept it. If AF was Midway, Japanese intelligence would translate the report into their own cipher and pass it up the chain. And somewhere in that chain, in a message Rochefort's team would then intercept and read, the Japanese would refer to a water supply problem at the location designated AF. Nimitz approved the trick. On the 20th of May, 1942, the radio operators at Midway transmitted a plaintext message on an open channel. Their distillation plant had failed. Their freshwater reserves were dangerously low. They needed resupply. 2 days later, Rochefort's team read a Japanese intelligence report. AF, the report said, was experiencing a water shortage. The Japanese had confirmed their own target, in their own words, in their own cipher, sent over their own radio circuits. Rochefort took the intercept to Nimitz. He said very little. He did not need to. The 2-letter designator that Washington had spent 6 weeks disputing had just been resolved by the Japanese themselves. Midway, early June, 4 fleet carriers. Nimitz issued his operational orders. Task Force 16, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a 55-year-old cruiserman who had never commanded carriers in battle in his life, and who was there because William Halsey had been hospitalized with a debilitating skin condition, would take Enterprise and Hornet to a position northeast of Midway called Point Luck. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, would join them with Yorktown, which brought Nimitz to the 3rd impossible decision of the campaign. Yorktown had been hit at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May. A Japanese bomb had penetrated 4 decks of the carrier and detonated deep inside her hull. 66 men had been killed or wounded. The carrier had limped back toward Pearl Harbor, trailing an oil slick 10 miles long. When she arrived on the 27th of May, the shipyard's chief engineer inspected the damage and reported that repairs would take a minimum of 90 days. Nimitz gave him 3. The estimate was not a negotiation, it was arithmetic. If Yorktown was not at Point Luck by the 4th of June, the ambush would be conducted with 2 American carriers against 4 Japanese. 2 against 4 was not an ambush. 2 against 4 was a slaughter. 3 against 4 gave the Americans a fighting chance. The shipyard put 1,400 workers on the carrier in shifts around the clock. They welded structural steel. They patched compartments. They replaced electrical systems. Power to the entire dry dock was diverted from the rest of the base to keep the arc welders running 24 hours a day. Men who had been working since before dawn on the 27th were still on board when the ship sailed at 9 in the morning on the 30th. Some of them were still welding when Yorktown cleared the harbor. She headed northwest at flank speed toward a battle they were not certain she could survive to reach. The Japanese, meanwhile, had already decided she was not a factor. Japanese naval intelligence, the same intelligence apparatus whose codes were being read every morning in a Hawaii basement, had assessed Yorktown after Coral Sea as either sunk outright or damaged beyond the possibility of return to service before the end of summer. The battle plan for Midway had been drawn up on the assumption that the Americans could put 2 carriers into the fight at most, not 3. The plan had been signed by Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was 58 years old. He was the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet. He was the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood the industrial capacity of the United States better than almost any officer in the Imperial Navy, and had warned his own government, before the war began, that Japan could win 6 months of victory and then would begin to lose. 6 months, almost to the day, from Pearl Harbor was the 4th of June, 1942. His plan for Midway was elaborate. A feint at the Aleutians to draw off American attention. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, striking Midway from the northwest. A landing force to seize the atoll. A battleship force, including his own flagship Yamato, moving up behind the carriers to finish off whatever American ships responded to the attack. He assumed the Americans would respond late. He assumed the Americans would arrive with 2 carriers or fewer. He assumed the Americans would not know he was coming. Every one of those assumptions was wrong. On the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked Midway exactly as Joseph Rochefort had said they would. And while their strike aircraft were being refueled and rearmed on their carrier decks crowded with fuel lines and ordnance and open bomb magazines, American dive bombers found them. In a window of less than 10 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers were transformed into flaming wrecks. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Later that afternoon, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, was found and sunk. All 4 of the carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were on the bottom of the Pacific. Yorktown was lost as well, struck by 2 waves of Japanese aircraft during the battle, torpedoed by a submarine. 2 days later, she sank on the 7th of June. The 72-hour repair had bought her exactly 9 days of combat life. It was enough. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers. Japan lost more than 100 of her most experienced naval aviators, men who had been in continuous carrier operations since China in 1937 and who could not be replaced. Japan lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific War in a single morning and would never regain it. The United States lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 150 aircrew. The victory at Midway is often described in terms of aircraft, timing, and luck. All 3 played a role, but underneath the tactical outcome of the battle was a decision that had been made weeks earlier in a quiet office at Pearl Harbor by the 29th choice for a job no admiral in America had wanted. Rochefort was right, the Redmonds were wrong, but Midway was one battle. The Pacific Ocean contained hundreds of Japanese-held islands, thousands of miles of ocean between them, and a defensive strategy designed around the assumption that every one of those islands would have to be attacked, in sequence, to reach the Japanese home islands. Even after Midway, that geography remained. The problem of how to cross it, how to reach Tokyo without spending 5 or 10 years and millions of lives grinding through every fortified atoll in the Central Pacific, was the problem Chester Nimitz would spend the next 2 years solving. The solution he arrived at was so counterintuitive that his own senior amphibious commander opposed it. It broke a principle of naval warfare that had been considered foundational since the writings of Alfred Thayer Mahan half a century earlier. And it began with a decision to leave 27,000 Japanese soldiers alive on an island, cut off from the war, and simply walk around them. That decision, and the reasoning behind it, is the second of the 3 moves that won the Pacific War. The map on the wall of the CINC-PAXI conference room measured 8 feet by 12 feet, and Chester Nimitz had begun to hate it. It was the Pacific Ocean, all of it. From the coast of California to the coast of Asia, from the Bering Sea to the Solomon Islands, drawn in tiny blue lines with tinier black dots scattered across it like grains of pepper on a tablecloth. Each of those dots was an island. Each of those islands had a Japanese garrison. And between the westernmost American base at Pearl Harbor and the Japanese home islands at Tokyo lay 4,000 miles of open ocean, broken only by those dots. In the summer of 1942, in the weeks after Midway, Nimitz stood in front of that map with a marker in his hand and did the arithmetic that every senior American officer in the Pacific had begun to dread. The Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, the Mariana Islands, the Palau Group, the Bonin Islands, and beyond them, the Philippines, Formosa, the Ryukyus, and finally the Japanese home islands themselves. Hundreds of atolls, hundreds of garrisons, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers who had already demonstrated, at Wake and at Guam and on the Bataan Peninsula, that they would fight until they were killed to the last man. The prevailing military doctrine was that an advancing fleet must reduce the enemy strongpoints in its path before advancing further. You did not leave a fortified enemy position in your rear. You did not sail past a naval base full of enemy warships and let them cut your supply lines. You reduced the base, you captured or destroyed the garrison, you secured the ground. Then you moved on to the next one. The doctrine had been articulated in its modern form by Alfred Thayer Mahan, an American naval officer and historian whose 1890 work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, was still, in 1942, the single most important book in every naval war college on Earth. Mahan's principle was simple. Command of the sea required the destruction of the enemy's fleet and the neutralization of his bases. Not the bypassing of them, the reduction of them. Nimitz had been trained on Mahan, and Nimitz had begun to understand, standing in front of that map in the summer of 1942, that Mahan was going to cost the United States a decade and 1 million lives. The math was straightforward, and it was terrible. If the Pacific Fleet reduced every Japanese-held island in its path, at Guadalcanal cost or Wake cost or worse, the campaign to reach Tokyo would consume the rest of the decade. The American public, which had been told after Pearl Harbor to prepare for a long war, had not been told to prepare for a war that lasted until 1950. The soldiers and Marines, who would have to storm each of those atolls in sequence, did not have the numbers to do it. And the Japanese, understanding the arithmetic as well as Nimitz did, had begun to fortify their central Pacific positions with an intensity that suggested they welcomed the prospect. There was another option. It was untested. It violated the doctrine of every navy on Earth. And Nimitz would spend the next 18 months arguing for it against his own staff, against his own senior amphibious commander, and against the collective weight of half a century of naval theory. Bypass them. Skip the fortresses, strike the gaps, use naval and air power to sever the supply lines of the bypassed positions, and let the garrisons wither in place, consuming their food and their ammunition and their morale, unable to move, unable to fight, unable to affect the outcome of the war. It was a strategy that assumed something no navy in history had ever been able to assume. That your naval and air superiority was so complete you could leave enemy forces intact in your rear, and trust that your operational logic was sound enough to make them harmless. It was a strategy that required, before it could be tried, that someone at the top be willing to bet the war on it. Before that strategy could be tested, however, the United States Marine Corps had to pay the price of the doctrine it was designed to replace. The place was Tarawa Atoll. It was one of the Gilbert Islands, a chain of low coral atolls near the equator, and it had been in Japanese hands since December of 1941. The specific island the Americans intended to seize was called Betio. Betio was less than 300 acres of sand. It was defended by roughly 4,800 Japanese troops under the command of Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, a 50-year-old career officer who had been sent to Tarawa specifically to prepare it as a demonstration fortress. Japanese propaganda had famously claimed that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. They were wrong about the 100 years. They were closer than anyone in the American command wanted to admit about the price. On the 20th of November, 1943, the 2nd Marine Division, roughly 18,000 men under the command of Major General Julian Smith, launched the amphibious assault on Betio. The plan called for the Marines to cross the lagoon reef at high tide, land on the beaches, and reduce the island in 24 to 72 hours. The tide did not cooperate. An unusual neap tide left insufficient water over the reef for the Marines' landing craft. Boats grounded 700 yards from the beach. The Marines, weighed down with equipment and weapons, climbed out of the stalled boats into chest-deep water and began wading. The Japanese, waiting in fortified positions constructed of reinforced concrete and coconut logs and steel plate, opened fire. The wade to the beach took, in some cases, more than an hour. The Marines who made it to shore found the beach itself under interlocking machine gun fire from Japanese pillboxes that the pre-invasion naval bombardment had failed to destroy. Concrete emplacements built to withstand direct hits from battleship main guns had, in fact, withstood direct hits from battleship main guns. The Japanese defenders were still inside them, still firing. For 76 hours, the 2nd Marine Division reduced Tarawa a pillbox at a time. They used flamethrowers, they used satchel charges, they used bayonets. When the fighting ended on the 23rd of November, the atoll was in American hands, and the price had been paid in a currency the United States had not anticipated. 1,009 Marines were dead, another 2,200 were wounded, for 300 acres of coral sand. The photographs came back to the United States within days. American newspapers printed them on the front page. The images showed dead Marines floating in the surf. Dead Marines heaped at the base of Japanese pillboxes. Dead Marines who had never made it out of their landing craft. Time magazine ran a photo essay. Life magazine ran another. The American public, which had been told that the Pacific War was being won, saw what winning it looked like. Letters flooded the offices of members of Congress, mothers of Marines, wives of Marines, fathers of Marines, demanding to know why 1,000 American boys had been killed for a sand spit no one had heard of 2 weeks earlier. Demanding to know whether the Navy and the Marine Corps had a plan for winning the war that involved something other than storming reinforced concrete pillboxes with rifles and grenades. Nimitz read the letters. He read the newspaper editorials. He read the private cables from Ernest King in Washington, the 64-year-old chief of naval operations, whose response to the Tarawa casualty list had been characteristically direct and categorically obscene. And Nimitz understood, with a clarity that had been building for 18 months, that the doctrine of reducing every strong point could not survive politically. The American public would not tolerate another 60 Tarawas on the road to Tokyo, and there were more than 60 fortified Japanese positions between Tarawa and Tokyo. The bypass strategy was no longer a theoretical alternative. It was the only option left. The place to test it was called Truk. Truk was a lagoon in the Caroline Islands, roughly 1,000 miles northwest of the Solomons, surrounded by a coral reef 50 miles in diameter. Inside the lagoon were multiple islands and one of the largest and most heavily fortified Japanese naval bases in the Pacific. It had been the forward operating base of the Imperial Combined Fleet for most of the war. It contained airfields, repair facilities, fuel storage, ammunition depots, and, at various times, elements of Japan's most powerful surface warships. 27,800 Japanese military personnel were stationed on and around the lagoon. The American press had begun calling it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. the comparison was not entirely accurate. Truk was better defended than Gibraltar. Its reef made amphibious assault extremely difficult. Its airfields could operate hundreds of aircraft. Its garrison, positioned on multiple islands within the lagoon, could not be reduced by attacks on a single beach. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, planning the Central Pacific Campaign in the fall of 1943, had assumed that Truk would have to be captured. It sat squarely on the direct route from the Gilberts to the Marianas. Leaving it in Japanese hands, with its airfields and its garrison, was contrary to every principle of the doctrine on which every planner had been trained. Truk would be reduced. Truk would be assaulted. Truk would be seized. The estimated American casualties for the assault on Truk exceeded the estimated casualties for every previous operation in the Central Pacific Campaign combined. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the 58-year-old commander of 5th Amphibious Force, agreed with the Joint Chiefs' initial assessment. Turner was Nimitz's senior amphibious commander. He was the man responsible for the planning and execution of every major amphibious operation in the Central Pacific. He had commanded the landing at Guadalcanal. He had commanded the landing at Tarawa. He knew what the Marines and the Army had paid to seize a fortified position, and he did not want any part of a strategy that pretended a fortified position could simply be ignored. The Japanese in Truk had ships. The Japanese in Truk had aircraft. The Japanese in Truk could sortie into the lines of communication of any American force that tried to bypass them and cut those lines to pieces. Turner told Nimitz that Truk had to be taken. Nimitz listened. He always listened. And then he began, over the course of several weeks in late 1943, to change his mind about the operation and to change Kelly Turner's mind along with him. The argument Nimitz made was not that Turner was wrong about the danger of leaving Truk intact. The argument was that the danger could be neutralized without an amphibious assault. American aircraft carriers, by the winter of 1944, had become the most powerful strike force ever put to sea. Task Force 58, under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, a 57-year-old naval aviator with a face like carved leather and a temperament that made Ernest King seem gentle by comparison, contained 9 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and the accumulated combat experience of 2 years of Pacific War. Mitcher had been one of the naval aviators on the NC transatlantic flight of 1919, the first crossing of the Atlantic by air. He had commanded Hornet at Midway. He had been at every carrier battle of the Pacific War that mattered. He did not speak much. He did not need to. When he issued an order, ships turned. Nimitz proposed to Turner and to the Joint Chiefs that Task Force 58 conduct a massive carrier airstrike against Truk, not to seize the base, to destroy its offensive capacity, to sink the ships in the lagoon, to burn the aircraft on the airfields, to crater the runways, to leave 27,000 Japanese soldiers alive on the islands, but with nothing to fight with, and then simply to sail past them on the way to the Marianas, the Philippines, and Tokyo. The strike was scheduled for the 17th of February 1944. It was called Operation Hailstone. On the morning of the 17th, in the pre-dawn darkness, Mitcher's carriers approached Truk from the northeast. Their radar screens filled with Japanese aircraft on the ground at the lagoon's 4 airfields. Their scout planes reported dozens of Japanese warships and transports at anchor in the lagoon. The Japanese, who had received intelligence warnings of an American strike weeks earlier, had already evacuated their heavy warships, but hundreds of aircraft, dozens of merchant ships, and a substantial force of destroyers, submarines, and support vessels remained. Mitcher launched. Wave after wave of American strike aircraft crossed the reef and descended into the lagoon. Hellcats swept the Japanese fighters out of the sky in the first hours. Avengers and Helldivers went after the shipping. The bombing continued through the 17th and into the 18th. By the time Task Force 58 turned away from Truk on the morning of the 19th, they had sunk approximately 40 Japanese ships in the lagoon and destroyed approximately 270 Japanese aircraft on the ground or in the air. American losses were 25 aircraft and 1 fleet carrier damaged, 25 aircraft, for the destruction of one of the 2 most powerful Japanese naval bases in the Pacific. Tarawa had cost 1,009 dead Marines for 300 acres of sand. Truk had cost 25 aircraft and left the entire base neutralized without a single American soldier setting foot on Japanese soil. The strategic argument was over. Kelly Turner, to his credit, understood immediately what had happened. In the weeks after Operation Hailstone, he became one of the most vocal proponents inside the American command for extending the bypass strategy across the rest of the Central Pacific advance. He had seen Tarawa, he had seen Truk. He knew which one he wanted to see repeated. The 27,000 Japanese soldiers at Truk remained on their islands. They remained there for the rest of the war. Cut off from resupply by American naval and air superiority, they consumed their stored food, their ammunition, their medical supplies, and their morale over the following 18 months. Some of them starved. Some of them killed themselves. Some of them ate the local population. The garrison, which had been fielded to fight the decisive battle for the Central Pacific, spent the rest of the war fishing on the reef with grenades and eating dogs. When the Japanese government surrendered on the 2nd of September, 1945, the Truk garrison surrendered with it, still armed, still fortified, still capable in theory of defending their positions. They had not fired a shot in the last year and a half of the war. They had also not affected the outcome of a single American operation. The lesson was so clear that Nimitz applied it in the following months with a ruthlessness that shocked even officers who had opposed the original decision. Rabaul, on the island of New Britain, one of the largest Japanese bases in the Southwest Pacific, was bypassed. Wewak was bypassed. Kavieng was bypassed. Panapi was bypassed. Yap was bypassed. WWII was bypassed. On island after island across the central and southwestern Pacific, powerful Japanese garrisons were left in place, isolated, and rendered strategically irrelevant. The American advance did not stop to reduce them. The American advance went around. Douglas MacArthur, the 64-year-old general commanding the Southwest Pacific Theatre from Australia, was initially resistant. MacArthur, who understood ground warfare and who had built his reputation on the doctrine of the direct approach, objected to the bypassing of Rabaul in particular. Rabaul was the anchor of Japanese power in the Southwest Pacific. Rabaul had a garrison of nearly 100,000 men. Rabaul had airfields, port facilities, and a harbour that could shelter the entire combined fleet. MacArthur argued, in extensive cable traffic with Washington, that Rabaul had to be taken. The Joint Chiefs, after considerable debate, sided with Nimitz. Rabaul was bypassed. The 100,000 Japanese soldiers stationed there spent the rest of the war planting gardens. Nimitz's Central Pacific offensive, in the 18 months following Truk, advanced faster than any theatre commander in the history of the United States military had ever advanced. Kwajalein in early 1944, Eniwetok, Saipan in June of 1944, where the Japanese combined fleet made a final major effort to defend the Marianas at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and lost 3 fleet carriers, 426 aircraft, and any remaining ability to contest American naval dominance. Guam, Tinian Peleli, Iwo Jima in early 1945, Okinawa in April of 1945. Each of those operations required an amphibious assault. Each of them cost American lives. Some of them, particularly Peleliu and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, cost American lives on a scale that made Tarawa look small. The bypass strategy had not eliminated the need to seize positions. It had eliminated the need to seize every position. Nimitz and his staff selected the ones that had to be taken because they were required for airbases, staging areas, or the next phase of the advance. Everything else was skipped. Between Tarawa in November of 1943 and the surrender of Japan in September of 1945, the American Central Pacific advance covered more than 4,000 miles of ocean, seized 15 major island positions, and bypassed more than 100 Japanese garrisons, totaling approximately 135,000 troops. Those garrisons, in the aggregate, represented a Japanese army almost the size of the German force at Stalingrad. It was left in place to consume itself. The strategy that Kelly Turner had initially opposed, the strategy that MacArthur had initially resisted, the strategy that violated the doctrine on which every American naval officer had been trained. That strategy had shortened the Pacific War by an unknown but substantial margin, and had preserved the American public's willingness to continue fighting it by refusing to spend Marines on real estate that did not need to be taken. There was, however, a second strategic decision Nimitz had made on the day the war began, which had been operating quietly and continuously in the background of every campaign since the 27th of December, 1941, and which was, by the summer of 1944, doing more to defeat Japan than the entire island-hopping campaign combined. That decision had been made in Washington hours after the Japanese aircraft had left the sky over Pearl Harbor. It had been implemented immediately and with total commitment by the new commander of the Pacific Fleet on the day he took the job. And it had turned, over the following 3 years, into the most successful commerce destruction campaign in the history of naval warfare. It was fought entirely underwater. It was fought by men that most Americans, then and now, could not name. It nearly failed twice for reasons that had nothing to do with the enemy and everything to do with the United States Navy's own bureaucracy. And by the summer of 1945, it had done what no army, no fleet, and no bombing campaign had yet been able to do. It had strangled the Japanese Empire from below. At 5:25 on the evening of the 7th of December, 1941, hours after the last Japanese aircraft had left the sky over Pearl Harbor, the Chief of Naval Operations of the United States Navy issued a single-sentence dispatch to every American submarine and every American surface warship in the Pacific. Admiral Harold Stark was 61 years old. He was sitting in his office in the main Navy building in Washington. He had spent the day watching the reports come in from Hawaii, from the Philippines, from Guam, and Wake and Midway, and he had reached a decision that in peacetime would have been considered a violation of international law. The dispatch read, "Execute against Japan unrestricted air and submarine warfare." 23 words, no preamble, no explanation, no caveats. For the previous 40 years, the United States Navy had officially opposed unrestricted submarine warfare as a war crime. It had been the German practice of unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking merchant ships without warning, that had helped push the United States into the First World War in 1917. Every American treaty commitment since had reaffirmed the principle. Submarines would surface, submarines would warn, submarines would allow merchant crews to abandon ship before sinking their vessels. Stark's dispatch abolished the principle in a single sentence. There would be no warnings, there would be no surfacing. There would be no distinction between warship and merchant, between military cargo and civilian passenger. Every Japanese vessel on the surface of the Pacific Ocean was, from that moment, a target. The dispatch reached Pearl Harbor a few hours later. The officer who received it was still under the command of Admiral Kimmel, whose relief had not yet been announced. When Chester Nimitz took command on the 31st of December, the war Stark had authorized had been running for 23 days. Nimitz made it the top strategic priority of the Pacific Fleet. He was a submariner himself. He had commanded 3 submarines in the early years of his career, had helped supervise the transition of the American submarine fleet from gasoline to diesel, and understood the weapon in a way that most surface officers did not. He knew that Japan, an island empire with virtually no domestic oil, no significant iron ore, and insufficient food production to feed her own population, could be defeated by the destruction of the merchant fleet that carried her imports. He also knew, in the first weeks of 1942, that the American submarine force was not going to accomplish that destruction anytime soon. The submarines were ready, the crews were ready, the doctrine was ready. The torpedoes did not work. The Mark 14 torpedo was the standard American submarine weapon. It had been developed at the Newport Torpedo Station in Rhode Island through the 1930s. It carried a warhead containing 643 pounds of high explosive. It could be fired from a submerged submarine at ranges up to 9,000 yards at low speed, or 4,500 yards at 46 knots. It was, on paper, one of the most sophisticated pieces of ordnance in the American arsenal. It also failed to detonate against Japanese ships with a frequency that, in the first 18 months of the war, approached 60%. The failures were of multiple kinds. Some torpedoes ran 10 feet deeper than they had been set to run, passing harmlessly beneath their targets. Some torpedoes ran at the correct depth but failed to explode on contact. Some torpedoes exploded prematurely, hundreds of yards short of the target. Some torpedoes ran in circles and came back at the submarine that had fired them. American submarine skippers, returning to base after patrols, reported the failures in blistering detail. They reported hitting Japanese destroyers with clean broadside shots and watching the torpedoes bounce off the hull with a metallic clang. They reported firing 4 torpedo spreads at Japanese carriers and observing no detonations of any kind. They reported fighting for weeks in enemy waters and coming home with empty torpedo racks and empty tonnage columns. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington did not believe them. The Bureau of Ordnance was the branch of the Navy responsible for the development, testing, and procurement of naval weapons. It had designed the Mark 14. It had developed the magnetic influence exploder that was supposed to detonate the warhead beneath the keel of a target ship, breaking the ship's back with an underhull explosion. It had certified the torpedo through years of pre-war testing. Its chief in the first years of the war was Rear Admiral William H. P. Blandy, a 51-year-old ordnance specialist, known to his colleagues as Spike. Blandy had been the bureau chief when the Mark 14 was fielded. He had signed the acceptance reports. He had authorized the doctrine that governed its employment, and he was not, in the first 2 years of the war, prepared to accept that his bureau had put a defective weapon into the hands of the American submarine force. When submarine skippers reported failures, the Bureau of Ordnance concluded that the skippers were at fault. They had misjudged the range. They had misjudged the target speed. They had failed to compensate for the torpedo's gyro angle. They had fired too soon or too late. The torpedo, Blandy's bureau maintained, was performing as designed. For 20 months, from December of 1941 until August of 1943, the American submarine campaign in the Pacific was conducted with a weapon its own designers refused to admit was broken. Nimitz knew. He had read the patrol reports. He had spoken with the skippers. He had watched his most experienced submarine commanders return to Pearl Harbor with intact torpedoes and empty conformation columns. He had also read the cables from Washington, in which the Bureau of Ordnance politely but firmly informed the Pacific Fleet that the reported failures were a training issue. He did not have the authority to redesign the Mark 14. He did have the authority to appoint the officer who would, in the summer of 1943, redesign it anyway. His name was Charles Andrews Lockwood. He was 52 years old. He had taken command of Submarine Force, Pacific Fleet in February of 1943, replacing Rear Admiral Robert English, who had been killed in an aircraft accident. Lockwood was a submariner of the old school, had commanded submarines since 1914, and had exactly the temperament required to do what Nimitz needed him to do. He was not going to wait for Washington. In June of 1943, Lockwood ordered a series of tests to be conducted off Kahulaway, a small uninhabited island in the Hawaiian chain that had been used as a Navy bombing range for years. He rigged a fishnet across a stretch of shallow water. He had a submarine fire Mark 14 torpedoes into the net, with warheads replaced by exercise heads to prevent explosion. Then he ordered divers to measure exactly where each torpedo had struck the net. The results confirmed what every submarine skipper in the Pacific had been reporting for 18 months. The Mark 14 was running, on average, 10 feet deeper than it had been set to run. A torpedo set for 10 feet was running at 20. A torpedo set to strike the target's hull was passing under her keel by a comfortable margin. Lockwood cabled the results to Washington. The Bureau of Ordnance, presented with unambiguous test data from the theater commander responsible for using the weapon, was compelled at last to acknowledge that the Mark 14 had a depth-setting problem. They corrected the problem within weeks. The correction was straightforward. It should have been made in 1942. The depth issue was solved. The exploder was not. By late summer of 1943, submarine skippers were reporting a new pattern of failures. The torpedoes were now running at the correct depth. They were now striking their targets. And in a substantial percentage of cases, they were failing to detonate on contact. Steel-nosed torpedoes were slamming into Japanese hulls at 46 knots and simply bouncing off or piercing the hull without exploding, or exploding harmlessly beneath the water. Lockwood ordered a second round of tests. Lift torpedoes were fired at underwater cliffs off Kahulaway. Unexploded torpedoes were recovered by divers. The exploder mechanisms were disassembled and examined. Lockwood's engineers determined that the Mark VI contact exploder, which was supposed to trigger the warhead when the firing pin was driven backward by impact, had been designed with a firing pin so heavy that in a perfect square hit, the pin's inertia bent it against its guide rails before it could travel far enough to detonate the primer. The perfect hits were failing, only glancing close blows were exploding, which explained in a single sentence why some torpedoes had been detonating and others had not for the entire first 2 years of the war. Lockwood ordered the exploders modified in the field. Machinists at Pearl Harbor began machining down the firing pins on every Mark XIV torpedo the submarine force possessed. By September of 1943, the Pacific Submarine Force was firing a weapon that, for the first time in the war, did what it had been designed to do. The results, in the months that followed, transformed the Pacific War. American submarines sank 146 Japanese merchant ships in November of 1943 alone. They sank twice that number in the following 6 months. By the end of 1944, the Japanese merchant fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war strength. Oil deliveries from the Dutch East Indies, on which the entire Japanese war economy depended, had slowed to a trickle. Warships were laid up in port because there was no fuel to sortie them. Aircraft were grounded. Factories fell idle. The Japanese Empire, which had gone to war to secure the resources of the southern resource area, could no longer transport those resources to the home islands that needed them. By the summer of 1944, American submarines had begun to sink Japanese warships as well. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, the submarine USS Albacore, under Commander James Blanchard, fired a spread of torpedoes at the Japanese carrier Taiho. Taiho was Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's flagship. She was the newest and most powerful carrier in the Imperial fleet, commissioned in March of 1944. One of Albacore's torpedoes struck her forward, rupturing an aviation fuel tank. 6 hours later, gasoline vapors ignited inside the ship. Taiho blew apart from within and sank with 1,650 of her crew. That same afternoon, the submarine USS Kavala, under Commander Herman Kostler, fired 4 torpedoes at the Japanese carrier Shokaku. Shokaku had been one of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. 3 of Kavala's torpedoes hit. Shokaku burned for 3 hours and then sank, taking 1,263 of her crew with her. 2 Japanese fleet carriers, sunk by American submarines in a single afternoon. It was the first time in the history of naval warfare that submarines had killed capital ships in a fleet engagement. The men who did that work paid for it. The single most decorated submarine commander in the Pacific War was Commander Richard H. O'Kane. He was 33 years old in 1944. He was the captain of the USS Tang. He had learned his trade as executive officer of USS Wahoo under the legendary Dudley Morton, who had been lost with his ship in October of 1943. O'Kane had taken command of Tang for her first patrol in January of 1944, and over the next 9 months he had sunk more Japanese tonnage than any other American submarine commander in the war. On the night of the 24th of October, 1944, Tang was operating on the surface in the Formosa Strait when she encountered a Japanese convoy. O'Kane began an attack. Tang fired her last 2 torpedoes. The first ran normally toward the target. The second turned hard left, circled back, and struck Tang amidships. The submarine broke apart and sank within seconds. 9 men, including O'Kane, were blown clear of the bridge into the water. Others escaped from the forward compartments as the submarine settled onto the bottom in 180 feet of water. 15 crewmen survived the sinking. All 15, including O'Kane, were captured the following morning by Japanese destroyers and spent the remainder of the war in Japanese prison camps, where they were tortured, starved, and beaten. O'Kane weighed 88 pounds when he was liberated in August of 1945. The torpedo that had sunk Tang was a Mark 18 electric, not a Mark 14. But the circular run that had killed her crew was the same category of failure that the Bureau of Ordnance had spent 20 months denying. The lesson of the Mark 14 had not been fully absorbed. It would not be fully absorbed until after the war. 52 American submarines were lost in the Pacific War. 3,505 American submariners went to the bottom with them. It was the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American armed forces in the Second World War. 1 in 5 men who put to sea in an American submarine did not come back. They had sunk, in return, 1,314 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling more than 5.5 million tons. They had sunk 214 Japanese naval vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. They had cut the Japanese Empire off from the resources that had drawn it into the war in the first place. By the summer of 1945, the strategic position was unambiguous. Japanese oil reserves had been reduced to less than 10% of pre-war levels. Japanese merchant shipping had been reduced to less than 15% of pre-war levels. The Imperial Combined Fleet could not sortie for want of fuel. The Japanese army in China could not be reinforced. Japanese industry could not be supplied. The Japanese Empire was, in the sense that mattered strategically, already defeated. The atomic bombs, dropped in early August, accelerated a surrender that the submarine campaign had already made inevitable. Chester Nimitz signed the surrender document aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September, 1945. He signed on behalf of the United States. He signed second, after General Douglas MacArthur, who signed as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. Nimitz stood behind MacArthur during the ceremony, in the position his rank required, wearing his standard service uniform. His expression changed from the expression he had worn on the deck of Grayling 3 years and 8 months earlier. He was promoted to Fleet Admiral, the highest rank in the United States Navy, in December of 1944, one of only 4 officers ever to hold that rank. He served as Chief of Naval Operations from 1945 to 1947. He retired to the coast of California, wrote very little, gave few interviews, and died at the age of 80 on the 20th of February 1966 at his home on Yerba Buena Island in San Francisco Bay. The Pacific War had been the largest naval war in human history. It had covered 60 million square miles of ocean. It had involved millions of men and thousands of ships. It had ended in the complete strategic defeat of the Imperial Japanese Navy, an outcome that in December of 1941 had seemed, to most competent observers, either impossible or many years away. 3 decisions had done more than any other 3 to produce that outcome. The first had been made in a basement, in defiance of Washington, on the word of a commander in a smoking jacket. The second had been made against the initial objection of the officer who would have to execute it, against the collected doctrine of every naval war college on Earth, and against the personal preferences of the American theater commander in the Southwest Pacific. The third had been made in a single cable on the evening of the day the war began, and had been implemented with total commitment by an admiral who understood, better than the Bureau of Ordnance had understood, what an American submarine could do to a Japanese merchant ship when the torpedoes worked. The admiral who made those decisions had never raised his voice. He had never claimed credit. He had simply, quietly, and without theatre presided over the destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy. That, in the end, was Chester Nimitz. Thank you for watching. Which of the 3 decisions do you believe was the most consequential to the outcome of the Pacific War? And which Pacific commander should we cover next? If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. We will see you again soon.